2 Kings chapter 2. 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 23 and 20 through 25. 2 Kings chapter 2, 23 through 25. You'll find a rather interesting passage of Scripture. It may be somewhat confusing, but we'll get to that in a minute. Earlier in this chapter 2, you'll read the passage where Elijah was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, a chariot of fire, and he let his mantle coat fall on Elisha to continue his ministry. Now, Elisha was maybe an understudy, a prophet in training, whichever way you want to put it. So Elijah's gone. Elisha has now assumed his ministry, and we find Elisha in chapter 2 on his way to Bethel, which, according to 1 Kings chapter 12, was a center of pagan worship in that day. Matter of fact, it was the center of pagan worship in that day. There was a golden calf, probably much like a lot of statues that are in the center of towns. It was set up by King Jeroboam, and there were many sacrifices that were made that were overseen by the priests at this golden calf. Once a year, there was a pagan festival that was held in Bethel. So not exactly the place you would have on your bucket list you wanted to go to visit, unless you were God's prophet and you were following his command to go there. Now you have to believe that Elisha wasn't going into this place blind. He knew just what was going on there, and he knew what he was getting into when he left Jericho. But he also knew one thing, that God was with him no matter where he went, and that he would provide and take care of him. And on his way to Bethel, Elisha was confronted by a group of young men who came out of the city. They were calling him names. They were taunting him. And in 2 Kings 2, 23 through 25, this is what it says. Then he went up from there to Bethel, and as he was going up the roads, youth came up from the city and mocked him and said to him, "Go up, you bald head. Go up, you bald head. Jerry, you bald head, go up." Oh, yeah, Kevin back there, he's a bald head. Now, we don't know if Elisha was completely bald or not. He may have had a short buzz cut. We don't know. But anyway, they were making fun of him. Now, the Bible said that these were youths, but the fact is, they were not youths. They were young men. They weren't children. They may have been priests in training. And they were probably sent out there by the priests to intercept Elisha from getting there and to force him to leave. Almost like we see these paid protesters that go to these cities and get paid to cause all these problems. This may have been what they were. But what they didn't realize, or what they may have realized, I don't know, that in ancient Israelite culture, prophets held a significant position as God's messengers. Disrespecting or mocking a prophet was a grave offense, as it was considered undermining the authority and the holiness of God's representative. If you look at 2 Chronicles 36:16, you'll see, but they mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against the people there, till there was no remedy. So God put a great value on the prophets and the word that they were bringing. And it was considered to be completely irreverent, completely wrong for somebody to mock what was going on. Now, I can't imagine what was said, but, when you get a crowd together like that, everybody gets brave and gets a whole lot of nerve that they probably wouldn't have any other time. They were probably saying things like, "You're just a wannabe prophet. We're not afraid of you. Go up." When they were talking about going up, they were talking about making fun of Elisha because they knew Elijah had ascended up to heaven, and they may have been saying something like, "Why don't you go up to heaven like your master did? What's the matter? Heaven's not good enough for you. It was good enough for him, but not good enough for you." So Elisha was catching a whole lot of grief from these teenagers, these young men. And you think about the attacks that were taking place on him. And you think about the way that Satan attacks and seeks to nullify God's ministry today and the work of God. He attacks the message, he attacks the messenger, or he attacks both to keep the message of God from getting preached. Or he'll try to discourage, or he'll try to discredit the teacher, the pastor, and he may even try to get people to believe that what they're hearing is nonsense. Satan's going to do anything he can to keep the message of God from getting out. He'll get it to focus on personalities, on people, on certain things that are going on, just to disrupt the message of God. And if he can do it, he will. The important thing, though, in this particular passage of Scripture is, yes, that's what Satan was trying to do, but the important thing was how Elisha handled the situation and how God responded to Elisha's response. Let's think about some things that Elisha did not do. And at the same time, think about some things when we've been confronted by people for maybe something we believe. Maybe we've been confronted by people who want to say something bad about the church. Maybe they want to say something bad about the people or someone that's in the church. And our normal reaction, in a lot of cases, is to retaliate. But this is not what Elisha did. He didn't turn and run. He stood his ground. He didn't argue with them. He didn't run after them. He didn't compromise the message that he had. He was not reacting in self-defense from the standpoint of, well, I'm Elisha and you can't talk to me like that, and that sort of thing. He didn't complain to the Lord about what they were doing. He didn't say, throw in the towel and forget about it. He, of all things, which is kind of hard for us to imagine, to think about today, is he ignored their words. That's hard to do today, to ignore the words of what somebody, especially when they're saying bad things about you, calling you names, and that sort of thing. He ignored their actions. Of course, it didn't say about what they were doing, but I'm sure they were doing something, and he ignored their attitudes. You know, don't you just get aggravated at people with attitudes? What he did teaches us what we should do. When trouble like this or some other trouble comes along, especially when it affects not just us personally, but what we believe and what our friends believe, what it teaches us to do is we should not resort to what the world does or what the world would do. For us, we shouldn't strike back. We shouldn't try to argue. Definitely probably shouldn't hit them in the nose or something like that. You know, that's the thing that we would want to do. But what did he do? What did Elisha do? If you look in verse 24, it says, so he turned around, he looked at them, and pronounced a curse on them in the name of the Lord. That's all he did. He turned around, looked at them, and pronounced a curse on them in the name of the Lord. He didn't curse them like cursing to curse somebody out and that sort of thing. He pronounced a curse on them in the name of the Lord because he realized their rebellious condition that they were in. He realized that they weren't going to respond to anything he said anyway, and that nothing he did was going to say was going to correct the situation. So he just turned around and basically said, okay, God, you handle it. I'm turning that over to you. Now that's good advice if we follow a lot of times. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. He left them to their own devices by saying, hey, you created this mess. Now you're going to have to deal with the consequences of what you've said. And if you look on in the last part of verse 24, it said, and 2 female bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of them. Female bears. I don't know why they weren't male, but they were female. And mauled 42 of them. Didn't say he killed them, but said he mauled 42 of them, which leads you to believe that there were more than 42 that were out there that were antagonizing Elisha and calling him names and that sort of thing. Maybe the other 42 got away when they ran. I don't know. But anyway, that was what the punishment was that God sent down from heaven for the actions these young men were taking. Folks, it's the same thing today. I was thinking about this last night. What happened in Minneapolis? These protesters got into that Baptist church, disrupted the service, causing all kinds of problems, going after the pastor because they thought he was some member of ICE. I was thinking, let's put this back happening in Elisha's day. And this same type scenario, which is basically what happened to Elisha, happened in Elisha's day. You wouldn't have needed any ICE agents. You wouldn't have needed any border patrol people. You wouldn't have needed any cops because God would have taken care of it. He would have handled the situation. Probably worse than what was done then. Elisha just turned around and I don't even think he stayed around to watch. He just said, it's your trouble. It's your problem. Now you deal with it. And I think many times we would be much better off in situations, maybe not like this, but in other situations where we just turned around and we just said, listen, I'm not going to discuss this. I'm not going to argue with you. I'm just going to turn it over to God and let him handle it. And let him handle you. And I know he will. Might not handle it in the way that we would want it handled, but God will handle the situation. And he still does that for us today. Sometimes we don't even know that it's happening, but God's gone before us and he's, what's the word I'm looking for? Not disarmed, but same type word. He's already taken care of it, neutralized it before we get there, and we don't have to deal with it. And I can imagine, Scripture says that Elisha left and went back to where he came from. He never evidently got into the city. He knew, the Lord was going to take care of him, and he did. And now, if it had been Elijah that this happened to, it would have been a different story, because Elijah was a little bit hot-headed, more hot-headed than Elisha was. And, it's like when he called down the fire on the prophets of Baal, killed them all. Elijah would have just said, okay, pointed his finger, that would have been it. But Elisha took the different approach, and he let the Lord handle his problems. And we would be better off, folks, if in many cases, or in most cases, if we let God handle our problems instead of thinking that we can do it and that we can make it better, because a lot of times all we do is make it worse. That's the message for today. And you want, now why? Can you think of anywhere else in the Bible that God brought down this kind of punishment on people? Now, he did during, the flood and that sort of thing, but to harm and maul and maybe kill, 42 prophets of Baal, whoever they were, but it sent a message. Don't mess with God, my prophets. Don't mess with my word. And he says the same thing today. Don't mess with those who have been called to preach the word or teach the word, and don't mess with the message that they've been instructed to bring, because there would be consequences and you will suffer them. You might not get mauled, but there's something going to happen that God will take care of, and he relieves you of any kind of responsibility and getting blamed for it. So that's the message today. I hope you can take that and apply it to your lives every day.